Hello, it's May 9th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean? Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have journalist and reporter Nick McAlpin.
Hello.
And senior journalist and editor Nadda Osman.
Hello.
News, everywhere I look is news. On with the show. We're going to kick off this week. Our first story is from you, Nadda. What's been going on?
This week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that Israel's cabinet unanimously voted to shut down Al Jazeera. He immediately ordered for the closure of their offices and their broadcasts. Hours later, footage showed police and Israeli inspectors raiding and confiscating their equipment from their office in East Jerusalem. Walid al-Omari, head of Al Jazeera's offices in the occupied West Bank, said, "The decision came as an incitement aiming at obliterating the truth, as Al Jazeera is one of the leading media outlets and conveys the truth about the consequences of this war on civilians and citizens, specifically in the Gaza Strip." So this shutdown comes a month after the Israeli Knesset passed a law that allows Israel to temporarily shut down foreign media outlets if they deem them a threat to security. This current shutdown lasts 45 days but can be renewed. And so far, Al Jazeera's TV channel has been completely banned in Israel. If you try to watch it, a message will appear on the screen saying that it's been prohibited from the air. Their website has also been blocked. And the timing of this has coincided with crucial negotiations between Israel and Hamas, as well as Israel's assaults on Rafah, where 1.4 million Palestinians are currently sheltering. And it's also worth noting it's not the first time that Al Jazeera has been targeted by Israel. They've been targeted before in 2017 when Netanyahu threatened to shut them down. And again in 2021, they destroyed their office in Gaza. And since then, we've seen plenty of Al Jazeera journalists being targeted or killed, notably Shireen Abu Akleh in 2022 and Wa'il al-Dahdouh in Gaza. His children, wife and grandchildren have been killed.
Nadda, why has Al Jazeera been banned? I mean, what's the reasoning what's the Israeli reasoning for this?
So Israeli authorities have not actually given a specific reason for banning Al Jazeera. They've just cited the fact that it's harming Israel's security. But Netanyahu has accused Al Jazeera of inciting violence against them and harming their security.
Harming security is incredibly vague.
Yeah, I mean,
reasoning.
There's been a lot of backlash since then. The actual reason, clearly, a silencing of Palestinian voices. A lot of people saying that it's just an effort to cover up the atrocities that Israel is carrying out in Gaza. And
which Al Jazeera have done a lot of. I mean, they've been incredibly prominent on the ground.
Yeah,
reporting.
I would say, even as a journalist myself, I relied very heavily on their Arabic reporting.
I think we all have.
They've got journalists all over Gaza, especially in the north, which a lot of UN and aid organizations have said there's now a famine in the north, and their reporters have honestly been very, very fearless.
What's Al Jazeera said in response to this? You say this is going to last 45 days but can be extended. I mean, are they trying to get back on the air?
So Al Jazeera have released a statement obviously condemning the shutdown. They've called it a criminal act. They've also said that their correspondents are going to still carry on reporting from Gaza and the West Bank. And they said that they're going to, continue providing news to a global audience despite the ban. I think it's also worth noting that, despite Israel's comments and claims, Al Jazeera has continually broadcast Israeli officials' news conferences and they invite Israeli analysts on air.
One thing I wanted to pick up on, just to take us back slightly, I'm sure you've seen the report, I think it was in Haaretz, about the Israeli Justice Minister. And, what did he have to say about Al Jazeera?
So there's been some interesting comments in Israeli media. So Israel Hayom correspondent said this week in a meeting with the captives' families that he knows little about the war and nothing is shared with him. And I quote, "Most of what I know is from watching Al Jazeera." Haaretz then went on to criticize him for his comment, saying that all other means of getting information, he's decided to choose Al Jazeera. So it's definitely been a very divisive comment in Israeli media. But generally, the sentiment in Israeli media is that Al Jazeera has been too sympathetic to Hamas and their reporting has been emotionally charged.
You mentioned the Israeli security forces going into the offices. I mean, what's happened to the journalists on the ground in Israel and to their offices? I mean, are they safe?
So correspondents are no longer able to report from Israel or the occupied East Jerusalem. Their offices have been completely closed, and it also means that there's a ban on any of their devices used for providing content. So this can mean like phones for news gathering or filming or anything else. So it has been quite a far-reaching and wide-reaching ban.
How have Israel been able to do this? I mean, shutting down a news organisation is not the habit of free and open democracies, which Israel likes to brand itself as. Yeah. So how can they do this?
Yeah, you're right. So Israel has a law that gives ministers the power to temporarily shut foreign news networks, and if they deem them a security risk. And Netanyahu has, made several comments to call Al Jazeera a terrorist channel.
Al Jazeera, as you mentioned, they have Israeli analysts and officials on air. I was wondering if this could spread to other Arab media outlets because, relatively speaking, Al Jazeera gives Israel a fair crack for the Arab media. There's a lot of Arabic outlets, of course we see language like the occupation, the Zionist entity, whatever it might be, strong language and, a very hard line on Israel from other outlets. So could this spread and see them taken off air or see them have their websites banned, for example?
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. And this is quite worrying because we've seen Israel's Minister of Communications saying that they're already looking at other networks to shut down, even Israeli ones, which they said which are not satisfying to the government. Israel has a long history of kind of blocking other news websites as well. So in 2021, they shut down Shihab News Agency in Arabic, which is based in Gaza. So this is definitely a worrying pattern, and it seems like it could spread.
To all our Israeli listeners, you can still read The New Arab in Israel. Nadda, what's the international community been saying about this?
So it's been widespread condemnation around the board. U.S. National Security Advisor John Kirby, he said that the U.S. administration is opposed to it and said that the work of independent journalism is absolutely vital. Obviously, these comments have been echoed by the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who said that the U.S. supports free press anywhere around the world. There's also been a lot of commentary kind of from human rights organizations and press organizations.
Well, what have they been saying?
Yeah, so the UN Human Rights Office have condemned it, also emphasizing the importance of free and independent media. And Greece's foreign finance minister, interestingly, called it a war on the truth and said it was preventing Israelis from knowing what's going on in Gaza.
I mean, on talking of press freedoms and things, where does Israel stand, in terms of press freedom, I suppose, globally and regionally?
So in terms of globally, Israel is currently at 101 out of 180 on the global press freedom ranking. Reporters Without Borders says that the formation of the new government in 2022 has increased pressure on journalists. If we're looking kind of at regional comparisons, Palestine ranks at 157, Saudi Arabia at 166, Egypt at 170, and Tunisia at 118. So
it's the best of a bad bunch then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is you mentioned a lot of fairly strong comments from Western leaders, but the question we always have on the tip of our tongues is, okay, maybe they say something, but are there any signs they're going to do something?
I think the obvious answer here is no. We've seen very prominent Al Jazeera journalists who have been working around the clock, like Anas al-Sharif, Hisham Zakut, Yumna al-Sayyid, Wa'il al-Dahdouh, have all criticised this. We've seen AJ's statements and still nothing has been done. We're a week into the ban now. And like we said before, it's quite worrying because this could spread to other outlets and very little has been done. I mean, even when it comes to things like Israel saying that they're going to investigate, the bombing of hospitals or attacks on Rafah, for example. We have not seen any substantial, evidence or reports or investigations into this. So I feel like very little will be done in terms of the blocking of Al Jazeera.
I think this is certainly bad for Al Jazeera. It's bad for press freedoms. I think it is also bad as mentioned, for Israelis who are looking for good, reliable reporting. Second story this week comes from you, Nick.
Yeah, so as I'm sure most of our listeners will know, Israeli forces seized control of Gaza's Rafah border crossing with Egypt on Tuesday, capturing a key lifeline to critically needed humanitarian aid. The long-threatened attack has raised concerns about the fate of the over 1 million Palestinians sheltering the city, given the disruption to the entry of aid and fuel supplies and the high numbers likely to be killed in any full-scale invasion. It comes as negotiations on realising a ceasefire deal continue. Speaking on May the 7th, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had this to say.
I urge the government of Israel to stop any escalation and engage constructively in the ongoing diplomatic talks. Haven't civilians suffered enough death and destruction? Make no mistake, a full-scale assault on Rafah would be a human catastrophe.
Nick, why don't you guide us through sort of what happened in Rafah over the week?
Sure. So, if we go back to Sunday briefly, there was emergency first responders told the news agency AFP that 16 people had been killed in Israeli airstrikes. So we had that. And then on Monday, we had Israel ordering the evacuation of some parts of eastern Rafah. And
100,000 people, right? They want to evacuate.
Their estimate's around 100,000, yeah. And I believe since then the United Nations has said, I believe in particular UNRWA has said it was around 80,000 that have fled following that. And obviously the humanitarian situation's dreadful. It has been dreadful for a long, long time. We're talking about an area with 1.4 million people around that. It's overcrowded. It's dangerous. Yeah, it's not good.
I think worth pointing out, those 80,000 people who fled are still in Gaza. They fled north.
Of course, they fled somewhere else.
Into other areas that are completely devastated and don't have humanitarian access.
Yeah, it may be that maybe they've gone to other parts of Rafah. It may be that they've gone to the Al-Mawasi area, which Israel claims is a humanitarian area. Of course, the evidence doesn't bear that out.
No.
But that's what they say. And as I said, obviously, Israeli forces seized control of Gaza's Rafah border crossing with Egypt on Tuesday. Now, that's a key lifeline for aid and for entry and exit. So that's really a big moment. It's
a big development, I think. People have been talking about the invasion, the ground assault of Rafah happening. We talked about it last week. It's been covered a lot across the media. Could we say that the invasion of Rafah has now started?
I think it's a matter of perspective. I would say yes, it has started because they've entered the area, so therefore the invasion has begun. Of course, it's not the full-scale assault that was feared, but that could be coming very soon. We don't know if that will go ahead. If it very well could do, and that would be devastating.
Yeah.
And you've also spoken a bit about, evacuations, but what options do people have in terms of where they can go now? Because clearly we've seen in the past that Israel hasn't allowed for safe corridors or safe passages, and even when they have, people have still been attacked.
In one short answer, they don't really have any options, unfortunately. I was actually at a press briefing yesterday that this was a theme that came up. I believe there was one official with Médecins du Monde, a medical organisation, that called the concept of safe zones. I believe she said it was a lie, and she's not the only one. Antonio Guterres, UN chief, he also has said there are no safe places in Gaza, and other NGOs have said the same thing as well. So really, there are no safe places. Al-Mawasi area, which is often touted, Israel says now that it's expanded that so-called humanitarian area, but people won't be safe there. And what's more, there isn't really space for them anyway, even if they were safe.
Nor is there time to evacuate, and logistically, it's just a nightmare. And even before this kind of invasion, we've seen that it's extremely difficult for Palestinians in Rafah to even go to Egypt.
The cost is huge.
We've seen around $10,000+ per person, which is just not feasible for anyone.
Nick, you mentioned, we've had Israeli tanks now at the border with the Rafah border crossing. What is the status of the border now? Is it open? Is it closed? What's actually happening there?
So, obviously, I'm mindful. This is at the time of recording. It's a very fluid situation. That's one thing we can say. So, in terms of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, that has been closed since being taken over by Israel on Tuesday. And also nearby, there's another crossing called Karam Abu Salim, also known as the Kerem Shalom crossing. Israel closed that following a rocket attack that killed 4 of its troops on Sunday. Israel has said the crossing was since reopened, but according to UN officials, there hasn't been any aid coming in, and there's nobody able to take delivery of relief anyway due to the hostilities.
The Rafah bordering is shared with Egypt. What have they said about this? They've also got Israeli tanks now on their border, essentially.
Yeah. So, following the seizure of the Rafah border crossing, Egypt said the Israeli attack risks attempts to reach a ceasefire. And that's important because the Egyptians are key in mediating negotiations alongside the Qataris and the Americans. So, that's a significant development. I think one major issue for the Egyptians is what's known as the Salah ad-Din corridor, also known as the Philadelphia corridor. That's basically a buffer zone along the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And Israel used to control this area around 2 decades ago. But it's an issue for Egypt. They're in control of it. And obviously it's very uncomfortable for them to have foreign troops along their border area as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. And the international community, what have we heard from them?
Yeah, so the UAE, which has normalised ties with Israel, has condemned the takeover of the Rafah crossing. China's called on Israel to stop its attack on Rafah. A Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said on Wednesday that Israel starting a ground operation in Rafah was a, quote, additional destabilising factor, including for the entire region. And I think that's quite interesting because a lot's been made about the potential regional repercussions for Israel's war on Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Syria, and that speaks to that issue a little bit. Obviously, Russia has strong links with the Syrian regime and also with the Iranians. So there's that point there. And actually, there was a very, very strong statement from Saudi Arabia, and there's, of course, been a lot of reporting and talk about normalization between Riyadh and Israel. So the Saudi Foreign Ministry said that Riyadh warns of the, quote, dangers of the Israeli occupation forces targeting the city of Rafah as part of its systematic bloody campaign to storm all areas of the Gaza Strip and displace its residents towards the unknown. And then later in that statement, very interestingly, the Saudi Foreign Ministry said it was, quote, renewing the kingdom's demand for the international community to intervene immediately to stop the genocide carried out by the occupation forces against defenseless civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories.
I really can't keep up with the Saudi Arabia and Israel stuff because they put out comments like that, they put out statements like that, which are strong, diplomatically strong by any measure. And then you also are getting, you see an increasing number of reports about sort of the US and Saudi Arabia getting closer to some sort of agreement where they could normalize with Israel, or they could be something with Israel. And I cannot keep track of actually what on earth is going on there.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to remember, and this goes for Saudi Arabia, this goes for the Arab world and the Muslim world as a whole, the populations do not want normalization. So whatever the political leaders are thinking, they have to bear in mind that they have their own citizens at home who are watching what they're saying. So at least on a public level, they need to be saying the right things just to placate the home front, as it were.
Yeah. You mentioned the humanitarian situation. Obviously has been desperate for months now.
Absolutely.
The Rafah crossing was a key crossing for the delivery of aid. Can aid now get in, or is it all closed off? Or who knows, maybe is even more aid going to be able to come in now that Israel's in control of the border?
Well, I don't think the last point about more aid coming in is likely, unfortunately. Obviously, as we talked about, the Rafah crossing with Egypt has been closed. The Kerem Shalom crossing, which is nearby, again, closed, but then Israel says it's reopened. But then according to UN officials, there hasn't been any aid coming in. So it seems that it's closed. So the answer, I think, unfortunately, is, aid is in a bad spot, in a very bad spot.
Earlier this week, we saw Palestinians celebrating at the news of a potential ceasefire or even a permanent ceasefire. We saw them celebrating out in the streets in Gaza. So what happened there?
Yeah, so we had Hamas on Monday. They said that they accepted a ceasefire deal proposal by the Egyptian and Qatari mediators. So I think a lot of people, including Palestinians in Gaza, they thought, great, we're now going to see a ceasefire, maybe permanently, maybe it might not be permanently, but at least some sort of respite. Israel took issue with the deal that Hamas had approved, and so we're not on an agreement. Negotiations continue, but as I say, Israel taking problems with that deal, and therefore hostilities continue. And
it's psychological as well, because they're hearing reports that, this could be a potential ceasefire, and then the next thing they know, there's airstrikes.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think, we don't even know the full extent of what people... You could never imagine what people are experiencing right now in the Gaza Strip. It's something that very few people will be able to understand. The scars, mental as well as physical, people will probably never recover from that, and you couldn't expect them to either.
No. And finally, the US this week announced it was withholding a delivery of bombs to Israel amid fears that an Israeli ground offensive on Rafah would result in an unacceptably high civilian death toll. Speaking to the Senate Appropriations Committee Defense Subcommittee on May 8th, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed the pause.
So we've been very clear, Senator, as you know, from the very beginning that Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions.
So what exactly has been delayed?
So the delay was confirmed on Tuesday. We know that this week at least one shipment has been delayed, which consists of 1,800 2,000-pound bombs and 1,700 500-pound bombs. These are, with the 2,000-pound bombs, it's thinking that they are, for all you munitions experts out there, likely to be MK84s or possibly BLU 109s, both snappy names. These are high payload explosives. They can be fitted with guidance systems or not. I think in cases we've seen that they've not been. The final determination on this, although they have been delayed, this is not a final situation. They are still working to decide whether or not to deliver these bombs or not. So it could come further down the pipeline. US officials have said that talks with Israel are ongoing, and that, according to them anyway, the US has been reviewing its weapons transfers to Israel since April. It's worth noting that this delay is not related to the $17.5 billion military aid package that Congress passed a couple of weeks ago.
So what exactly is the United States objection?
There's a risk, as they put it, it's a risk to civilian life. They say that Israel has not, quote, fully addressed US concerns over the humanitarian needs for civilians in Rafah, which you talked about, Nick. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, in that same subcommittee, he said, quote, "I think we've also been very clear about the steps we'd like to see Israel take to account for and take care of those civilians before major combat takes place. We would certainly like to see no major combat take place in Rafah, but certainly our focus is making sure that we protect civilians. I mean, it's a nuance, really, but they are not against an operation in Rafah. What they seem to be against is an operation in Rafah that has high civilian casualties, which is what we've seen throughout the rest of Gaza.
My question is, how do you even have an operation in Rafah that won't have high civilian casualties?
Right, so I think this is the biggest question now, is at what point does it become acceptable for the US? You say, we have 80,000 or so who have evacuated. Israel say they want to do 100,000 get evacuated out of Rafah. Does that become acceptable then for the US? Do you have to...
This is also coming after a death toll, a collective death toll in Gaza, at the very least of 34,900 people.
Exactly.
I mean, when does it become wrong at this point?
Yeah.
So I think this is now the biggest question that people are probably going to be asking regarding the US's approach to this is, when does it become acceptable? They're saying they don't have a problem with this, but when does it become acceptable? When is that toll low enough? Is it 20,000 people, who can die? And that makes it okay for them? We don't know.
And does this mean there's going to be a total weapons export ban?
So this was teased. I mean, last week, no. This week, maybe. President Biden gave an interview to CNN on Wednesday, and he said, quote, "I've made it clear that if they go into Rafah," they haven't gone into Rafah yet, "if they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities that deal with the problem." So he's saying that they would cut off all essentially offensive weapons to Israel if they went into Rafah. Now, as you brought up, Nick, have they gone in? Have they not? Well, that depends on
it's a blurry line,
It's a blurry line, right? I mean, he did say that, defensive weapons will continue, I think, no matter what. Namely, the Iron Dome, which they used to shoot down projectiles, that will continue. But it's going to be things like artillery shells, tank shells, I'm guessing rifle rounds and bullets. If Rafah is assaulted, this is what he seems to be saying, is that will not happen.
I guess what's interesting then is, I said to Nadda earlier, we often see the West use words but not act. Is this action, or perhaps some would say it's too little too late? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
You got to hope so, right? I think after so much, we have to cling on to hope. Words are cheap, though. That would be my comment. Words are cheap. To actually follow through with this, is a much, much bigger step from the US. For the likes of, EU countries, it would be a big step, but not nearly. I mean, for the US to stop arms exports to Israel would be colossal. And I think it will be a long road before we get there. But it's a significant development in US-Israeli relations.
And I'm guessing Israel hasn't been too happy about this, have they?
You would be right on the money, Nadda. So Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, he was on public radio. He said, quote, "This is a difficult and very disappointing statement to hear from a president to whom we've been grateful since the beginning of the war." He added that Biden's comments would be interpreted by Israel's foes, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, as, quote, "something that gives them hope to succeed." And he also said that this is going to not help them in their goal of eliminating Hamas. Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's far-right finance minister, he was pretty defiant in a statement. "We will, quote, we will achieve victory in this war, despite President Biden's pushback and arms embargo." There was a bit more of a savvy response from Boaz Bismuth, a member of the Israeli Knesset. He said that he believes that this has more to do with sort of Biden's US domestic problems more than.
I also saw. I also saw Ben Gvir tweeted out Hamas heart emoji Biden after that.
Yeah,
Right.
Ever the diplomat.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So when you say domestic concerns, we're referring to the discontent from many in the US with regards to Biden and the US's support for Israel's war on Gaza. Is that?
Yes. I mean, obviously, we've had the college protests now go on for weeks.
Since 17th of April, yeah.
Since 17th of April, so almost we're closing on a month now. Before we get ahead of ourselves, I think it is questionable, really quite questionable about how much those protests are directly impacting US policy. Now, I would say probably not a great deal. But I think what those protests certainly are doing, which is sort of trickling down the pipeline towards US policy, is it's certainly raising the profile for the war in Gaza. This is what I think. The protests are constantly on the news. They're speaking to protesters, many of whom are, very intelligent people who are very knowledgeable about the situation, who are coming out with, I've seen plenty of them where they've just been very reasonable people saying, let's not kill kids. Because that's
just calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah, of course, calling for a ceasefire. That's not a good thing, and we don't want, to be complicit in that. That's not a good thing. Which aren't, outrageous. For most, I think, average Americans are not outrageous statements to make. I think viewing of these protests on the news has been particularly boosted by police brutality, which create very shocking images on the news. And who doesn't like watching shocking images on the news? I think we have protests now in a couple of very key swing states for Biden, where he has victory in the last election by tens of thousands, which if they swing, those people don't go out and vote for him. These can cause serious problems for Biden and for his election campaign. So I think there is quite a strong argument to say that the protests on US campuses are not changing US policy, but they are raising a massive amount of awareness, which we have not seen probably for the rest of the war in the US and in the US mindset, particularly going into an election year.
Which kind of answers the question, why has Biden decided to do this now, especially after the,
Yeah.
Yeah.
To their credit, and the US, I've said this before, the US don't deserve a lot of credit, but to their credit, I think there probably is some genuine concern about civilian life in Rafah. I think this isn't all a cynical thing. There was a poll published on Wednesday by the Data for Progress think tank and advocacy group. They said their polling showed a majority of US likely voters now support a ceasefire and humanitarian aid in Gaza. 56%, according to their poll, 56% of Democrats say they believe Israel is committing genocide.
That's a big number.
That is a big number. And that means 56% of Biden's voters disagree with him and disagree on his foreign policy, which is incredibly significant. Over 1/3 of voters say they believe military aid to Israel should be decreased, while 18% believe it should be increased. Data for Progress, who ran this poll, said that since their last polling in November and February, that there had been a marked increase in the number of voters saying that the US should call for a permanent ceasefire.
With this delay, does it seem that Israel will be unable to assault Rafah because of shortages, or in the scheme of things, will this not make too big of a difference to the military offensive?
Not immediately, in truth. I mean, it's only bombs, right? Which sounds flippant, but, it doesn't include tank shells. It doesn't include artillery shells. It doesn't include bullets. There are still plenty of ways that Israeli forces can assault Rafah.
And we've seen tanks.
And we've already seen tanks. In terms of sort of aerial munitions, Israel has plenty. They can continue to use those. Eventually, if these shipments do continue to be held up, they will eventually run out. I think the only real significance this could be for Israel is without, essentially flattening the ground ahead of her advancing Israeli army, it will obviously make it a much more dangerous expedition for an army to go into Rafah, where we know, there are Hamas battalions there and the Hamas fighters there. And it will be a lot more dangerous for them if they can't just, flatten a building or drop a bomb on tunnels and things like this.
Is there an element in which maybe in the immediate term, it won't make a huge difference militarily, but the political impact will perhaps restrain Israel's ability to wage its war in Rafah?
Yes, it could certainly restrain their ability in Rafah. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has said time and time again that they will do this. They will go into Rafah. Seemingly in response to this, he reposted today, actually, a clip from a speech he gave several days ago, maybe over a week ago, in which he said that they will go ahead with...
No decision by any international forum will stop Israel from defending itself. As the Prime Minister of Israel, the one and only Jewish state, I pledge here today from Jerusalem on this Holocaust Remembrance Day, if Israel is forced to stand alone, Israel will stand alone.
I think there's quite a fairly strong argument to say here that part of this might not just be about Rafah, right? There are fears, growing fears, that when Israel is essentially believes it's finished with Hamas, it will look to the north, it will look to Hezbollah, it will look to the Houthis in Yemen, and obviously it will also look to Iran. And I think there's a sense that this delay of arms and the threat to cut off more arms could be more about restraining Israel's ability to attack Hezbollah, to attack Iran, and to attack the Houthis, and to prevent any more flare-ups in the region and prevent a wider conflict. So this could be read as an attempt by the US to reassert some control over Israel. Plenty of other noteworthy things have been happening this week. Got one here. Eurovision organisers to ban Palestinian flags. Organisers of the Eurovision Song Contest say they reserve the right to remove flags of non-participating countries as Israel's war on Gaza rages on. Are you going to be watching the Eurovision Song Contest? I think the final is this weekend. And are we anticipating this being a big protest movement?
It's a no from me. I'm not going to be watching it. To be fair, I never have. But I imagine there will be protests. There often is around the Israeli involvement in the contest.
Yeah.
So we can expect that, I think.
We've already seen one guy. It was in one of the semi-finals. I think he was wearing a kafir.
He was. I think he's Swedish. He was a former contestant.
Yeah, he was last year's winner, maybe. Was he?
Yeah, and he had a kafir on his wrist, and he's actually got a Palestinian father. Who was, I think, raised or born in Lebanon, and he received a lot of backlash, and the organisers of Eurovision called him out on it, and they're maintaining that they're a non-political competition.
Which is very interesting, because following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Eurovision obviously removed the participation of Russia. So,
I mean, and also Ukraine won, which I think, I seem to remember people thinking their song was all right, but that's also a pretty clear political statement, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean
you can't. This is
and it goes back to what we've kind of the undertone of what we've been talking about today. So often with Palestine and Israel, there's a different standard. There's always a different standard.
Yeah.
It's not political if you do it to Russia, but if you do the same thing to Israel, all of a sudden it becomes political, and there's a question as to how fair that is, why that is, and I think it's just double standards that have long existed.
I think it's also worth noting here that Israel's Shin Bet security agency have accompanied one of their contestants to the competition.
Not just accompanied her, but they've been there working with the Eurovision organisers on
and
security.
There's been extremely high security all around the competition in the city. So I think any potential protest will possibly be quashed immediately.
I am not a Eurovision watcher. This might
Join
be
the club.
Well, this might,
same.
frankly, if I was going to watch any year, this might be the first year that I watch, just to keep an eye on, see if anything happens.
It's a no from me.
It's a no from you, Nadda. All right, fine. Another story here. Israeli forces arrest Greek consul's bodyguard in Jerusalem. The main opposition in Greece expressed concern over the arrest of the Greek consul's bodyguard by Israeli forces during Easter ceremonies in Jerusalem. The EU nations have provided support to Israel for years now, decades. Do you think they're sort of finally learning what sort of democracy Israel is and how much of a police state it is?
I'm not sure that they care, to be honest. I mean, this incident might annoy Greece and other EU member states, but at the end of the day, they have strong and long-standing strategic alignment with Israel, so I believe this will ultimately be brushed under the carpet and it will be business as usual.
I mean, I agree with Nick to an extent, but I also think that Israel's mask is lifting, and, what's happening in Gaza has exposed, the atrocities and everything else, so I think,
Yeah. Final story. US rapper Macklemore releases pro-Gaza track Hins Hall. The rap star addresses the US's role in Israel's war in Gaza, the genocide, and the police's response to the US campus protests in his new track, Hins Hall. Have you either of you two listened to this? What do you think of it? Nick, you're our music correspondent, I think, aren't you?
I wouldn't say I'm a massive music fan, but in this case, I have heard the song on social media, saw it on Twitter, or X as it's now known.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was an interesting intervention by someone who is a big star with a large following.
Yeah.
Will it make a difference to the course of events? Probably not. But it's interesting to see solidarity expressed by someone with a prominent platform.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought it was an interesting song that's been obviously well received by a lot of activists and supporters of Palestine.
Agree. Yeah. I mean, even if I wasn't a Macklemore fan before, I mean, I am now. I think it means a lot to Palestinians and activists and people worldwide to have such a kind of a prominent public figure show their support for Palestine. And Hind's story is absolutely devastating. I mean, she was a 6-year-old girl trapped in a car who saw her family members being killed, and yeah, I think it means a lot to people to have someone...
She was killed herself as well.
Yeah, she was killed herself as well.
Yeah. Hind Rajab, just to...
A 6-year-old, yeah.
Just to make sure the listeners are aware of who exactly we're talking about.
I have listened to it and I thought it was great.
And that's what matters.
That's my input. A lot of great stuff on the New Arabs website this week. Picks of the week. Let's start with you, Nadda.
Yeah, my pick from this week is from the features section, and it is titled, Why Do Israel's High-Tech Dystopian Weapon Systems Have Biblical Names? It's by Raval Muhiddin, and this article explores the rationale behind Israel's use of biblical symbolism for its weapon systems and operations.
Nick, what have we got?
This week from me, we've got Israel is a broken society, and it's not just Bibi to blame. This is an opinion piece by Palestinian-British researcher and writer Imad Musa. And I think it's a bit like this podcast. It's here to give a wider context. We're not dealing with just one man, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Nick, you can come on the podcast again. My pick is from the analysis desk, How Egypt's crackdown on Gaza protests show the fragility of Sisi's regime. It's by Lara Gibson. Even after a decade of unrivaled power, Sisi's regime in Egypt is too fragile to allow any meaningful show of political free expression. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by journalist and reporter Nick McAlpin and senior journalist and editor Nadda Osman. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified for when a new episode drops. If you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. You can subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.